The Center for Migration Studies of New York commissioned over 20 papers on different aspects of the refugee protection system by leading scholars for a CMS conference and special collection of the Journal on Migration and Human Security entitled Rethinking the Global Refugee Protection System. In this video, Karen Musalo, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California, Hastings, discusses her paper, Seeking a Rational Approach to a Regional Refugee Crisis, the summer 2014 surge of Central American women and children at the U.S.-Mexico border and its aftermath. The paper is co-authored with her colleague Eunice Lee, co-legal director at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California, Hastings.
The paper that I co-authored with my colleague Eunice Lee looks at the situation of asylum seekers from what are called the Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And what it does is it tries to step back and take a larger view that looks at U.S. foreign policy going back maybe half a century that contributed to the conditions that exist in the Northern Triangle countries today. It looks at refugee flows from those countries in the 1980s, and then looks at the current refugee flows and how the U.S. is responding. The reason that we took this larger view is to make the point that the U.S. contributed through a lot of its foreign policy choices. It contributed to and helped create the situations that are causing the current day refugees. And that when there was high levels of violence and civil wars in those countries in the 1980s and early 1990s, and refugees came, the U.S. did not provide them protection as they should have under the law, and we lament the reality that as we see these other refugee flows now in the year 2014, 2015, 2016, we're seeing the same failures of protection. And they say those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And we felt it really, we could play a significant role in reminding people about U.S. policy in the region, both foreign policy and refugee policy. So one of the main points that we try to make in the paper is to address this controversy over what are the reasons for the migration flows. And some have called them refugee crisis, the large numbers of children and children with parents coming to the U.S. And there's one narrative that says these individuals are coming because U.S. policy is too generous. President Obama, talk of comprehensive immigration reform, the dreamers, deferred action for childhood arrivals, et cetera. We're so nice, people are coming. That's like the kind of pull. It's a narrative of the pull factors. And the other narrative is that they're coming because of the push, that conditions in the Northern Triangle countries are just so horrific that people are coming to save their lives. And so the main point of the paper is to really take these two narratives and present the facts and make the argument that the pull factor is, it may help to justify wrong-headed policy decisions, because if you believe in the pull factor, then you say we should be harsher and we should send a message. But we're saying, no, that's not true. It's the push. And if you believe it's the push factor, then your response has to be to address the root causes that push people out. So that's really what the paper sort of explores, is what's causing people to flee, what are our policies, and set within this larger context of what's been U.S. policy in the region going back 30, 40 years. Yeah, so these countries, I want to put the gender violence within the context of overall levels of violence. So the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are among the 5 highest, how can I put this? They are within the countries that have the highest homicide rates in the world. And that includes countries that are at conflict. So countries where wars are raging don't even have higher homicide rates than the Northern Triangle countries, with the exception of Syria. And so if you look at the high rates of violence in general, and then within that you look at levels of violence against women, they also are extremely high. We refer to a phenomenon that's known by the term femicide or feminicide, which is a gender-motivated killing of a woman, meaning it's a killing of a woman that's for no discernible motive other than the fact that she is a woman. And again, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala have the highest femicide rates in the world. If I remember the statistics correctly, El Salvador has the highest femicide rate in the world, Guatemala the third, and Honduras the seventh highest in the world. So we're looking at countries that have extremely high levels of violence against women. Those are killings of women, but if we say, okay, that's at the extreme end of violence, but just the levels of incidents of beatings, rapes, other brutality against women, it's extremely high. And it's within a situation where the government does not respond. And so there is impunity for those who commit acts of violence against women. So a lot of what's driving the migration of women are the levels of gender violence that they're experiencing. But I want to say it is within the larger context of extreme levels of violence against children also, and against other individuals. Okay, so in our paper, we write about both U.S. policy in the region going back 30 or 40 years and how U.S. policy really contributed to the dire conditions that exist in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala today. And we also look at how those policies we pursued in the 80s, or I could go back, depending on the detail, I could go back to 1954 when the U.S. was behind the overthrow of Arbenz, a democratically elected president of Guatemala. I could go to the armed conflict in El Salvador where the U.S. funded an incredibly brutal military. You could look at what we've financed in Honduras and how we've supported repressive elements there. And all of these policies that we engaged in starting in the 50s, going through to the 80s and 90s, contributed to the situations, the dire situations, both in terms of violence, in terms of poverty, in terms of social exclusion. And unfortunately, when people fled these conditions 20, 30 years ago, the U.S. didn't provide them with protection. The U.S. chose to say, these are not legitimate asylum seekers. And so the question is, what have we learned? And I actually say I would actually have to say we haven't learned. And that's in a way why we wrote this article and tried to make the connections we're making to say, look, we should learn that our foreign policy can either be used in a way that contributes to refugee problems or in a way that solves them. And we should recognize what we're doing. And then when there are refugee problems, when people are fleeing situations where they're in need of protection, we should do the right thing. We should be a principled enough country that is really acting in harmony with our ideals of support for democracy and human rights. And we shouldn't send people back to their death, which is something that we did in the 1970s and 1980s, and that unfortunately we're doing it again in the year 2016. Yeah, so the question of deterrence fits into this larger discussion of, as we saw increasing numbers of asylum seekers coming from the Northern Triangle countries, part of what the administration endorsed was to try to deter them from coming, to send a message, to be harsh. And first of all, if we say deterrence isn't working, before I would even address whether deterrence is working or not, I'd like to say that deterrence is an inappropriate response to refugees who are fleeing. Any country that professes to be in compliance with its ratification of the Refugee Convention and the Refugee Protocol, a country like ours that has enacted a Refugee Act, so it's in our domestic law, we shouldn't try to deter people fleeing persecution. We should actually not deprive them of access to the U.S. where they can seek this protection. So number one, deterrence is wrong. Number two, deterrence doesn't work. And the best analogy or sort of metaphor I could give is if somebody is in a building that's on fire, and they're 3, 4, 5 floors up, and they know it's dangerous to jump, but they're looking at the flames behind them. They may very well jump rather than take their chances on the dangerous flight than the sure death of the flames that are licking at their shoulders and their back. And I would say that's not too dramatic of an analogy for those who are fleeing the violence in the Northern Triangle countries. So deterrence isn't going to work. When you know for sure you'll be dead tomorrow if you don't leave, and you face maybe harsh consequences in the U.S., you're going to choose between those two, and you'll say, I'll take my chances. But we shouldn't even be talking deterrence. That's just not the right solution. Yeah, so the externalization of the southern border, it's this concept of countries, and the U.S. is one of them. We've seen it in the European Union. We've seen it with Australia, of countries that have committed to protect refugees. But it's really a false promise, because at the same time they've committed to protect refugees, they have found ways to prevent the refugees from arriving to their borders where they could seek protection. So I'd have to say it's really a very, I think, shameful practice, the externalization. And what the consequences are is really often what I would call constructive refoulement. And that's a term. Refoulement means the return of an individual to a country where their life is at risk. And every country that's a party to the Refugee Convention and its protocol has pledged itself not to refoul people. And that principle of non-refoulement is also a principle in what we call customary international law. It's a principle that all nations are supposed to respect. And the externalization of borders, I think, creates a serious breach of the obligation to non-refoulement, because it's outsourcing it. So let's just tell Mexico to stop those asylum seekers from getting to the U.S. where they could seek asylum, and wink, wink, nod, nod. We know you, Mexico. You'll look at their claims carefully, so those deserving of protection will get protection. When the reality is that anybody who does serious research and investigation into Mexico and its process for identifying and protecting asylum seekers know that it is failing in every respect. So the consequences of externalization of borders is sort of a dishonest fig leaf of, oh, we're complying, but you're really preventing individuals from reaching your border, and you're contracting out, the dirty work of returning people to where they'll be harmed. So I just think it's a very disgraceful practice. Yeah, so there's this, what I think policymakers need to know about migrant women and children is that they bring legitimate claims for protection under international law and under U.S. domestic law. There is this perception, and it's an incorrect one, that somehow these claims that women and children bring for protection, they don't fit. There's this almost a time warp where some people, some policymakers are stuck in the sort of paradigm that's almost a Cold War paradigm, that the only legitimate asylum seekers are people fleeing persecution by the state. And our human rights law has really advanced to where we now recognize that individuals can be persecuted by non-state actors, by gangs, by members of their community. And we also recognize that women's rights are human rights, that children have human rights, and therefore when either women or children face a serious violation of their fundamental human rights, they qualify for protection. And it really is unfortunate that many policymakers don't understand that. They just look at these, at women and children as this monolithic population that somehow is fleeing something they don't understand, but it certainly doesn't fit the refugee definition. And those who have, I think, a deeper understanding of the refugee definition and how it should be interpreted and applied know that actually that's not true. But we have a lot of education to do. And I think it's for two reasons. One is that I think truly and honestly, some of the policymakers don't understand the law well enough. But I also think it's fear of the floodgates. So it's kind of an opportunistic perspective. If we don't recognize they're really refugees, then we don't have to take them. And if we do recognize they're refugees, we might have to take them, and gee, there's a lot of them, and that's the fear of floodgates. But there are lots of other solutions rather than depriving people of protection. So I think this is a really opportune moment in time for the Journal on Migration and Human Security to produce this special edition on rethinking the refugee definition. And not so much that I think the definition itself needs to be revised or revamped, but I think that there needs to be a process of educating people to how it should be properly interpreted and applied in our times. The refugee definition came into existence in the wake of World War II. It was a different situation in terms of what kinds of violations of rights people experienced, but that doesn't mean that the definition has lost its currency or its validity, but it does mean that we need to think about what it means in today's world. How do we interpret it in today's world? And the part that I do think we need rethinking is a way, how do we rethink the challenge or the dilemma that many countries that are parties to the Refugee Convention and Refugee Protocol give lip service to it, but actually find every single way they can to get around or to avoid the obligations that it imposes. So whether it is the United States externalizing its borders and outsourcing deportation of Central American refugees to Mexico, or whether it's Australia with its Pacific solution of interdicting and then housing asylum seekers in these Nauru and Papua New Guinea and refusing to process their claims, or whether it's the EU where we have Hungary erecting fences in the midst of this Syrian refugee crisis, we need to rethink how can we persuade countries that it's in the community of nations common self-interest, best interest, national interest, to address those who are fleeing persecution in a just and fair and humane way. Because, today it might be the Central Americans, today it might be the Syrians, tomorrow, who knows what country. And I think we all, want, to create conditions that if we were those refugees, we would be protected. But if we don't create a system that really respects the law and international obligations, then we're at risk also. So if we have to appeal to people's own self-interest, let's do it that way. So the rethinking is both, bringing people to understand that the definition should be looked at under the current conditions, and it has a lot of ability to evolve and expand and meet the current challenges, and that we need to find a way to have countries be serious about their obligations.